January 17, 1945. Northern Luzon, Philippines. The winter monsoon had turned the mountain roads into rivers of mud. Snow did not fall here, but the rain came down like steel needles, cold and unrelenting, drumming against the canvas tarps of supply trucks and turning every foxhole into a grave waiting to be filled. In the pre-dawn darkness, Sergeant Takeshi Yamamoto of the Imperial Japanese Army's 14th Area Army crouched inside a stone farmhouse at the edge of a village called San Manuel. Through a shattered window, he watched the horizon, waiting for the American column that intelligence had warned was coming. He had been a soldier for 4 years. He had fought in Manchuria, where the winters froze men solid in their sleep. He had survived Bataan and the brutal jungle campaigns of New Guinea. He thought he had seen every form of war the Americans could deliver. He was wrong. What approached through that gray dawn was not merely an army. It was an industrial apocalypse on treads, a fusion of American engineering and tactical fury that would redefine the very concept of terror in modern warfare. The sound reached him first. A deep, mechanical growl that seemed to shake the earth itself, followed by the high-pitched squeal of steel tracks grinding over stone. Then, he saw it emerge from the mist like a dragon from ancient mythology, an M4 Sherman tank, but not any Sherman he had seen before. Mounted on its turret was a weapon that seemed to belong not to this world, but to some medieval vision of hell. The flamethrower tank had arrived. The Japanese command had prepared their soldiers for many things. They had distributed manuals on how to construct spider holes and tunnel networks. They had trained men to strap explosives to their bodies and throw themselves beneath American armor. They had instilled the code of Bushido so deeply that surrender was considered a fate worse than death itself. But nothing in their training, no passage in their field manuals, no whispered story from veterans of Guadalcanal or Tarawa had prepared them for what the Americans called the Zippo tanks, M4 Shermans modified with the Canadian Ronson flamethrower system, capable of projecting napalm-thickened flame across distances of over 80 yards. The Americans had learned a brutal lesson in the Pacific Theater. Traditional infantry assaults against fortified Japanese positions cost too many lives. On islands like Peleliu and Iwo Jima, every cave, every concrete pillbox, every village became a killing ground where Japanese defenders fought with suicidal determination. Standard artillery could collapse a tunnel entrance, but the Japanese simply dug deeper. High explosive shells could destroy a bunker's firing slit, but the defenders merely waited in interior chambers until the barrage lifted, then returned to their positions. The Americans needed a weapon that could reach inside these fortifications, that could turn underground refuges into crematoriums, that could break not just the defensive positions, but the psychological will of an enemy who believed death in battle was the highest honor. The answer came in fire. The POA CWS H5 flamethrower system, mounted on the M4 medium tank, carried 400 gallons of napalm mixture, a jellied gasoline that clung to surfaces and burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The system could fire 10 times before requiring refueling, each burst lasting between 6 and 8 seconds. But raw statistics could not capture what the weapon actually did when unleashed. The flame that erupted from the Zippo tanks was not the clean, orange fire of a campsite, or even the red fury of an incendiary bomb. It was black and yellow and orange all at once, a liquid horror that moved like a living creature, flowing around corners, seeping through ventilation gaps, following the contours of trenches and tunnels as if possessed of malevolent intelligence. Sergeant Yamamoto and the 140 men of his battalion had transformed San Manuel into a fortress over the preceding 3 weeks. They had reinforced the stone buildings with sandbags and logs. They had dug connecting trenches between structures. They had positioned their Type 92 heavy machine guns to create interlocking fields of fire across every approach. They had stockpiled ammunition, medical supplies, and enough rice to withstand a siege of 2 months. Their commander, Captain Noboru Ishikawa, had told them that holding this village was essential to the defense of the entire mountain region. "The Americans expect us to run," he had said during the final briefing. "They think we are defeated. We will show them that Japanese soldiers do not retreat. We will make them pay for every meter in blood." The first Zippo tank rolled to within 50 yards of the village perimeter, just as dawn broke fully over the mountains. The rain had diminished to a cold drizzle, and in that gray morning light, Yamamoto could see the modifications clearly. The elongated barrel of the flamethrower protruding from where the bow machine gun would normally be, the armored fuel tanks strapped to the rear deck, the blackened scorch marks on the hull from previous engagements. Behind it came 4 more Shermans, these equipped with standard 75mm guns, and behind those, a full company of American infantry moving in tactical dispersal. The Japanese opened fire first, machine gun tracers stitched across the muddy road, sparking off the lead tank's frontal armor. A Type 89 grenade discharger team launched a spread of knee mortar rounds that bracketed the American column. For a few seconds, it seemed like a conventional firefight, the kind Yamamoto had survived dozens of times before. Then the lead Sherman stopped, traversed its turret slightly to the right, and fired. What erupted from the flamethrower was not a stream but a torrent, a cascade of liquid fire that arced through the air and splashed across the front wall of the nearest building like a wave breaking against rocks. The napalm mixture adhered to the stone and wood, burning with such intensity that the entire structure seemed to ignite simultaneously. Men stationed inside that building had perhaps 3 seconds to comprehend what was happening before the temperature inside their defensive position exceeded anything compatible with human survival. Those who ran outside were already on fire. Those who stayed inside were consumed where they stood. The Japanese defenders had believed their stone buildings would protect them, as they had protected generations of Filipino farmers before them. "Stone does not burn," they had reasoned. "We can withstand incendiary attack." But the Americans were not trying to burn the stone. They were burning the oxygen. Inside any enclosed space struck by napalm, the temperature spike was so extreme and so sudden that the air itself became lethal. Men died, not from burns, but from breathing superheated gas that seared their lungs from the inside. The lucky ones lost consciousness within seconds. The unlucky ones had time to understand exactly what was happening to them. The Zippo tank moved forward 10 yards and fired again, this time at the trench system connecting the perimeter buildings to the village center. The flame followed the trench line like water following a channel, and the soldiers crouched inside had nowhere to go. Those who tried to climb out were cut down by American infantry. Those who stayed in the trench were incinerated. The third burst targeted a 2-story structure that had been the village school before the war and was now the Japanese command post. The napalm splashed through the ground floor windows and ignited everything inside: ammunition crates, medical supplies, wooden furniture, and 37 human beings. From his position in the stone farmhouse, Sergeant Yamamoto watched his entire defensive plan disintegrate in less than 4 minutes. The carefully prepared positions that were supposed to exact maximum casualties from the Americans were being eliminated without the enemy suffering a single casualty. The interlocking fields of fire meant nothing when the gunners were burning alive. The stockpiled ammunition became a liability when superheated napalm cooked off entire crates of rifle rounds and mortar shells. He looked at the 11 men under his immediate command, boys, most of them, conscripts from farming villages in Kyushu and Shikoku, who had been in uniform less than 8 months, and saw in their faces something he had never seen before in Japanese soldiers. Not just fear, but existential terror. The tactical doctrine of the Imperial Japanese Army in 1945 was built on the principle that superior spirit could overcome material disadvantage. Japanese soldiers were taught that their willingness to die gave them a moral and tactical advantage over Americans, who the propaganda described as soft individualists, unwilling to sacrifice themselves. The reality that confronted Yamamoto and his men in San Manuel was the exact opposite of what they had been told. The Americans were not trying to match Japanese willingness to die. They were using their industrial supremacy to make Japanese willingness to die irrelevant. The flamethrower tanks did not require courage from their operators. The men inside those Shermans were not heroes in the traditional sense. They were technicians operating machinery that made heroism unnecessary. A second Zippo tank moved up to engage the eastern side of the village, while the first repositioned to cover potential escape routes to the north. The American tactics were methodical, almost surgical. They did not rush. They did not take risks. They simply moved from structure to structure, burning each one systematically, waiting for survivors to emerge, cutting them down with machine gun fire, then moving to the next target. This was not battle in any romantic sense. This was industrial-scale extermination. Private Kenji Tanaka, a 20-year-old former fisherman from Nagasaki, who had joined Yamamoto's unit only 3 weeks earlier, broke first. He stood up from his position, threw down his rifle and began screaming that they had to surrender, that they had to show a white flag, that fighting this was madness. Corporal Hideo Sato, a veteran of the Burma campaign and a devout believer in the warrior code, struck Tanaka across the face and told him that Japanese soldiers do not surrender. Tanaka kept screaming. The argument lasted perhaps 30 seconds before a burst from the advancing Zippo tank engulfed the entire front section of the farmhouse. Tanaka and Sato both died instantly. Yamamoto and 4 others scrambled out the back door into what had been a vegetable garden and was now a crater-filled waste of mud and shell fragments. The Americans had deployed 6 flamethrower tanks to San Manuel that morning, part of the 713th Tank Battalion's assault on Japanese defensive positions throughout the northern Luzon campaign. After-action reports from American commanders would later describe the operation as highly effective, and note that organized resistance in the village was eliminated within 40 minutes. Japanese casualties were listed as 137 killed, 0 captured. American casualties, 2 wounded, neither seriously. The disparity was so extreme that it barely qualified as combat. It was more accurately described as clearing. But numbers alone cannot convey what occurred in the minds of the Japanese soldiers who survived the initial assault and spent those 40 minutes watching their world burn. The psychological weapon the Americans had deployed was more devastating than the physical one. Every principle of Bushido, every lesson from training, every reassurance from their officers that courage and determination could overcome American material superiority, all of it was revealed as lies in the face of the flamethrower tanks. A man could accept death in a fair fight. Japanese soldiers had proven that thousands of times across the Pacific. But there was nothing fair about the Zippos. There was no moment of courage, no test of will. There was only the mechanical certainty of industrial killing. Sergeant Yamamoto made it to the edge of the village with 3 others. They crawled through a drainage ditch that ran parallel to the main road, their uniforms soaked with mud and reeking of smoke. Behind them, San Manuel burned with a heat so intense they could feel it on their backs, even at a distance of 200 yards. The smoke rose in a black column that must have been visible for 20 miles. As they crawled, Yamamoto found himself fixated on a detail that seemed absurd, even as it consumed his attention. The Americans had so much fuel. The amount of napalm required to burn an entire village was staggering. Each Zippo tank carried hundreds of gallons. They had deployed 6 tanks. Simple mathematics suggested the Americans had brought more than 2,000 gallons of flamethrower fuel to this single engagement, for this single village, in this single day of a war that had already been raging for 3.5 years. The abundance was obscene. The Imperial Japanese Army was starving. Yamamoto's own rations had been cut to less than half the regulation amount months ago. Supply lines were disrupted. Transport ships were being sunk faster than they could be replaced. Every bullet had to be conserved, every shell hoarded. And yet here were the Americans, bringing thousands of gallons of specialized fuel to burn down a village that had no strategic value beyond denying it to the enemy. What kind of nation could afford such waste? What kind of industrial base could produce not just the weapons, but the fuel, and the vehicles, and the spare parts and the radio equipment, and all the 1,000 other items required to support an army operating 6,000 miles from its homeland? This was the thought that broke Yamamoto more completely than the actual flames. He had believed the propaganda about American decadence and weakness. He had accepted the narrative that Japan's spiritual superiority would eventually triumph. But an enemy that could waste resources on this scale was not weak. An enemy that could bring 6 flamethrower tanks to burn a single village was not running out of anything. The strategic situation he had been told about, that America would eventually tire of the war, that the cost would become too great, was revealed as fantasy. America was not fighting like a nation on the edge of exhaustion. America was fighting like a nation that had barely begun to exert itself. In the weeks that followed, as Japanese forces across Luzon were systematically destroyed by American combined arms tactics, stories about the flamethrower tanks spread through the remnants of the 14th Area Army like a virus. Soldiers who had never seen the Zippos in action spoke of them with the same tone medieval peasants must have used to describe plague or demon possession. The tanks became mythologized, grew larger in the retelling, acquired capabilities they did not actually possess. Some said the flames could reach 300 yards. Others claimed the napalm could burn through solid stone. A few insisted that the Americans had developed a new type of fuel that could not be extinguished by water or dirt, that burned until it consumed everything it touched. The reality was terrifying enough without embellishment. By March 1945, flamethrower tanks were being deployed across the Pacific Theater, wherever Japanese forces had established strong defensive positions. On Iwo Jima, where the volcanic rock made tunneling easy, and every cave became a fortress, the Zippos were instrumental in reducing positions that might otherwise have required days of fighting. On Okinawa, where Japanese defenders had turned the entire island into a network of interconnected defensive works, the flamethrower tanks became routine tools of assault, deployed as casually as engineers might use bulldozers to clear debris. The psychological impact on Japanese forces was measurable in the rising surrender rates, which had been virtually zero in 1943, but began to climb significantly by mid-1945. Soldiers who might have fought to the death in a conventional engagement found themselves unwilling to face the flamethrower tanks. The weapon violated something fundamental in the warrior culture the Japanese military had tried to cultivate. A soldier could charge machine gun nests because there was at least the possibility of reaching the enemy, of achieving something through courage. A soldier could defend a bunker against artillery because there was randomness to shell impacts, a chance that the next round would fall elsewhere. But the flamethrower tanks were neither random nor possible to charge. They were systematic, patient, and absolutely lethal at ranges that made close combat impossible. The symbolic object that haunted Japanese survivors was not the flame itself, but the thick, oily smoke that preceded each burst. The way it rolled out of the flamethrower barrel for a fraction of a second before ignition turned it into fire. That smoke became the herald of annihilation. Men who survived flamethrower attacks reported that in later battles, even the sight of an ordinary Sherman tank advancing through smoke, from grenades, from cooking fires, from anything, could trigger panic. The association between smoke and imminent death by fire became so powerful that it overrode training and discipline. Captain Ishikawa, the commander who had promised to make the Americans pay in blood, died in the burning command post in San Manuel. His body was identified 3 days later by the tags found in the rubble. According to American intelligence reports, he had shot himself rather than face the flames, a final act that would have been considered honorable under different circumstances, but which spoke to the complete psychological collapse the flamethrower tanks induced even in veteran officers. Sergeant Yamamoto survived the war. He was captured in April 1945 after his unit, reduced to fewer than 30 men and completely without supplies, surrendered to American forces near Baguio. In interviews conducted decades later, he would describe the flamethrower tanks as the moment he knew Japan had lost not just the war, but the fundamental argument about which system, imperial militarism or democratic industrialism, could better mobilize a nation's resources. They brought more fuel to burn one village than we had to supply an entire battalion for a month, he said in a 1987 interview. That was when I understood we were not fighting soldiers. We were fighting factories. The flamethrower tank represented everything the Pacific War had become by 1945. Mechanized, impersonal, overwhelming. It was the perfect weapon for an industrial democracy at the height of its power. Designed not to test courage, but to eliminate the need for courage entirely, to reduce combat to a problem of logistics and engineering. For Japanese soldiers raised on tales of samurai honor and the spiritual superiority of the warrior willing to die, the Zippos were not just weapons, but philosophical refutations. They said, "Your courage is irrelevant, your training is irrelevant, your willingness to die is irrelevant. What matters is steel and fuel, and the productive capacity to manufacture them in quantities you cannot imagine." The villages burned, the caves burned, the bunkers and pillboxes and spider holes burned. And in the burning, the last illusions of the Imperial Japanese Army burned as well. The belief that spirit could overcome material, that determination could defeat abundance, that a warrior's heart was worth more than a factory's output. The flamethrower tanks cleared entire villages in hours, but what they truly cleared was an ideology, a way of understanding war that belonged to an earlier century. The war would end 4 months after San Manuel, not because Japan ran out of soldiers willing to die, but because Japan's leaders finally accepted what men like Yamamoto had learned in the flames, that no amount of courage could overcome an enemy with unlimited resources and the willingness to use them. The atomic bombs that fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were merely the ultimate expression of the principle the flamethrower tanks had demonstrated on a smaller scale in 100 villages across the Pacific. That American industrial might, once fully committed, was unstoppable not through any individual act of heroism, but through the systematic application of overwhelming material force. 70 years later, historians would debate the ethics of weapons like napalm and the flamethrower tanks. They would question whether the efficiency of killing justified the horror of the method. But for the men who faced those weapons in the winter rains of Luzon, ethics were abstractions. What was real was the smoke and the heat and the terrible understanding that they were not combatants in a war between armies, but obstacles to be cleared by a machine that did not hate them, did not fear them, and would not stop until they were gone.